Hello, hello, possums, yes it is I can speak you smooth. And art thou enjoying thy stayeth in the Endwalker Reef? Yes, that's my Uriange, do you like it? I do apologise for being away for a few weeks, but it just became clear quite early on after Endwalker launched that there are a number of people on YouTube and forums and Twitter who get their jollies out of basically spoiling the story for everybody else. So I decided I was just going to avoid all of those places, and I'd just make a free company only channel in game, so I wouldn't be spoiled by yells or tells or anything else. That worked for the most part. There were a couple of free company members who unfortunately didn't know what a spoiler was until it was too late, so some of the stuff was slipped away from me. But anyway, I'm done now, and I had a lovely time, and I'd just like to go over some of my initial spoiler-free thoughts on the main story quest in Endwalker, and just as a general whole, and some early first impressions of some of the places and characters too. So the only really potentially spoilery place in this video is going to be regarding a couple of characters that show up in the trailer. Now the trailer's been out for 6 months, and I kind of figure that if you are relatively interested in playing the game, then you would have seen this trailer by now. But for those of you who just don't do trailers at all, I will warn you in advance, and you can run screaming out of the room going la 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 and skip on to the next bit. Anyway, let's get cracking, shall we? The first thing I want to get into is pacing. Now, this is a very long main story quest in comparison to some of the other expansions, so it is a bit of a challenge to just keep things ticking over and maintaining interest, and the pace is noticeably turgid at the beginning and the end of the main story quest. That's just my personal opinion. There's no denying that Endwalker is a bit of a slow starter. Now I've heard arguments along the lines of this languid beginning to everything is needed to get all the pieces into place before you get hit with the big reveal at the end, but some of it really just struck me more flabby storytelling than anything else, and it could have done with a little bit of tightening. Now, of course, there is plenty of room in an MMO for pointless busywork. It's one of its main characteristics. But in Final Fantasy XIV, that tends to be delegated to the side quests, and I did almost every last one of them on my way, so I'm not sure why. Incidentally, it just became an obsession. I just couldn't leave the zone until I'd finished everything. Nevertheless, this actual period is quite mercifully short compared to the entire length of this chain, so it's not too much of an issue at the start. It doesn't stop you dead in your tracks, for example, but as you near the end, where it starts to slow down again, you expect a more climactic or frenetic pace. You're sprinting towards the finish, or you're sort of crawling on your hands and knees covered in blood. But neither of those happened. It was sort of like a comfortable jog on a sunny afternoon, that sort of thing. It didn't feel like there was a lot at stake. That said, all of the main story quest in between, the pacing was very well laid out, and it does feel meaningful as you traverse your very last steps in this saga. For the most part, nothing felt rushed or poorly explained. I do have a few questions, but that's for another video. And you felt like you were making actual progress in the story. So for the most part, they did a fabulous job on this, and you have to give respect to the amount of challenge involved in actually getting all of these story threads together from all over the place, and make sure that everything's progressing and everything has been tied off neatly. And for the vast majority of the main story quest, they succeeded in doing that. As to the end, I will deal with that a little bit later in this video. So, as I've mentioned previously, Yoshi did say that before Endwalker's release that the main story quest was going to be very long in comparison to other expansions, and it certainly doesn't disappoint in that respect. After all, there is an awful lot to pack into a story that has been going for so many years, and you consider all the triumphs and tragedies, wins and losses, the fates of so many characters and places, and then all of the new revelations as the icing on top. So it was always going to be of a fairly gargantuan size. However, it is possible to have too much of a thing, and they certainly did test the upper limits here in terms of length, I feel. One thing A Realm Reborn should have taught them is that having a main story quest that is interminably long actually puts a lot of players off, and they don't actually get to later expansions because of just the sheer length and scale of the story they're trying to tell. I certainly struggled with it in my early days in Final Fantasy XIV. Not only because having that much story thrust at you all at once was a totally new concept, having come from World of Warcraft, but you also get fatigued on a journey that just seems endless, and your challenge and interests sort of wanes away. On reflection though, having completed the main story quest now, and looking back on it, I think they got it about right here. I mean, I was beginning to tire towards the end, to be sure, and I think another zone's worth of trials and tribulations would have been too much. But, as with many things with Endwalker, they just knocked it out of the park and broke Bobby Kotick's favourite window in the process. Now I do want to go into a bit of a character study here. This is the potential spoilery bit because I'm going to be mentioning a couple of characters, one great and one not so great, that turned up in the trailer. Now the trailer's been out for 6 months, and if you haven't completed the main story quest up to and including Shadowbringers, there are possibilities that everything's going to be spoiled for you here, so by all means, if that's you, it's time to run out of the room. Right? Lovely. Okay. So, for all the rest of you, I would like to do a quick tale of these two characters. Because they were in the trailer, their appearance in it shouldn't really be a surprise to you, but as I say, one done well and one that really shouldn't even be there. And I think you know which one that's going to be. Anyway, we'll start with the good guy first, and I am, of course, referring to Fortuno Lavelier. Now, we are properly introduced to Forge back at the very end tip of Shadowbringers, when he brings the formal response from Charlian from the Oils in Alliance saying, "Can we have a hand?" And they go, "Nah." And he was probably the best man for the job to send him along. He comes across as more of a, stuffed shirt, pompous, downright unpleasant sort of individual, and about as undiplomatic a personage as you could expect. Even from Charlian, that's a good effort. And, in the process of giving the bluntest of no's, he also disowns his own children, Alphino and Alice, for not agreeing with everything he believes in, and then promptly just parades off back home. So it's safe to say that Forge hasn't made a terrifically good impression, but of course that's exactly what they're going for here. And when he appears in the trailer, he's the same old Forge, the embodiment of the organisation that he represents, and immovable to will or grand speeches. But here's where things get good. Over the course of the main story quest, the storytellers do a wonderful job of going into the background of this apparently emotionless, duty-driven individual. Family, duty, and love, basically. It is through his development across the storyline that we don't actually get to like him. I mean, I certainly don't, so I still don't like him, but, at least I understand where he's coming from and what really drives him. And he takes the classic character transformative journey that makes him into a different and more rounded person than, the utter bellend that we were presented with at the start. His relationships, particularly with his twin children, are a very, very important strand in the story itself. And, it's handled at its own pace, and there's lots of crucial detail and support characters that just give us a more rounded feeling to the guy. It's a prime example of, making the effort and taking the time to take a character from point A, where he's, to point B at the end, where he is a fairly transformed character. It's a classic, and it works. So, what doesn't work? Well, the opposite side of this coin, which is like all scarred and got bits of grit on it, is of course Xenos. Now, I don't know what it is about this Xenos fellow that the storytellers have found so compelling. Since his introduction in Stormblood, and his first death, he has been a one-dimensional busted flush of a character, really, a relic from a previous expansion that looks like he's been resurrected for no good reason and thrust into a main story quest that for the most part ignores him. Now I know I can't be alone in being underwhelmed by Xenos on his first arrival. The entirety of his character arc, in compared to, say, Fortuno's, is basically, I need an opponent that interests me, to I am now obsessed with an opponent that has bested me once and now interests me. So, there's no effort to make him any more complicated than that. Xenos, of course, has already been defeated once by the Warrior of Light. That's you. And back in Stormblood. And they have a second fight, but you have a sneezing fit and then you get drawn away to Shadowbringers. But, they just couldn't leave that well enough alone, and nothing in his characterization the first time actually merited a second bite at the cherry. I mean, even the Empire didn't want him back, his own father, Varys, included. Xenos is basically what I imagine a disconnected, angsty 15-year-old incel to be if they, suddenly became fully grown like Tom Hanks did in Big. His time was already long past, and I imagine the only reason they wanted him in Endwalker was because he's actually quite well suited to a Reaper weapon. I also personally feel that he is completely unnecessary to the main story quest. I mean, if you cut this guy out and all his appearances, you'd have to make minimal changes. I mean, he has a couple of grand entrances to be sure, but you know, it's nothing that couldn't be done by something or someone else. You know, the reason that Xenos is so underwhelming, particularly in Endwalker, is because there is a far larger threat. There's a far larger stake than this guy. You know, there is a far bigger evil to confront and overcome in Endwalker than, you know, the same standard unchanging flat track bully who's been following around shouting "fight me" all the time. And whenever he does appear in the story, it's jarring, almost as if, you know, they had to lever him into the story after it had already been approved and written out. And the unchanging aspect of him is a real downer. I mean, sometimes it is good to, you know, subvert the expectations of your audience, you know, to get a little bit of unexpected titillation, but, you know, it's also extremely important for your audience to be able to connect with your villains as well as your heroes. And, you know, having a one-tone beige antagonist is a challenging subject to keep interesting, especially as he's not in the top tier of enemies this time out. Ultimately, he just feels like he's in Endwalker because marketing said so, which is never a good reason for putting someone into a game. Now, there were a couple of notable absentees in the character list for the main story quest. I think the ones I noticed most of all were the Stormblood representation was a bit thin compared to the other expansions. I mean, there are people from Stormblood there, but not the ones you were expecting. I'm not sure if that's going to be a later patch or something, and they're just holding their fire on that one, but it just struck me as odd. As for the other characters in the main story quest, I would be spoiling all over the place. I'd be foaming spoils at the mouth if I went into their various trials and tribulations in Endwalker, so I will leave that for another video. All I will say for now is that there were many opportunities to show some courage in the writing, and they were occasionally found wanting. Now, going briefly over places, I'll number the zones as you encounter them in the main story quest, so people who are still going through it will have a general idea of what I'm talking about here. Now, generally speaking, the areas do really, really well. I mean, the two capital cities, fabulous. I mean, I prefer the more colourful Warren-y one to the other one. But that's just, you know, that's an aesthetic preference, really. And I preferred their zones as well. Zone 3, however, you know, when you hear about some fantastic place and it's like you've always wanted to visit it and you can't wait because, you know, there's sort of this mysticism attached to it. And then you get there and you have a look around and you realise that actually, all this time, it was all a bit crap. That's Zone 3 for me. You know, I just expected more from it because I've heard so much about it. And, you know, some of the side quests in that place were particularly dire. I mean, you know, side quests in general aren't terribly exciting things, but they really did hit a new low in Zone 3. The other zone that had issues for me was Zone 6, which is the end zone to end all end zones in Endwalker. It just struck me as a little bit on the anticlimactic side. It did feel unfinished and not properly fleshed out. It seemed a bit cobbled together at the last minute in places. You know, I suspect that if there was one major reason for the Endwalker delay, as in the launch delay, it would be Zone 6. You know, we're not talking like Shadowlands more like levels of awfulness here, but you know, like Zone 3, I expected much more from the zone, especially as it's the grand finale. Anyway, when it comes down to it, is the main story quest in Endwalker any good? Yes, of course it is. It is excellently done for the most part. You know, it's an outstanding amount of high quality work has gone into this, and it's a real credit to the team and the revered leader, who have woven quite the tapestry since the darker beginnings of Final Fantasy XIV. It's easily the best told story I've ever experienced in a game overall. And you know, it may even eclipse the even longer and even more heavily anticipated conclusion to the 20-year Warcraft saga that we're expecting in a single patch shortly. Incidentally, have you seen the new Sylvanas trailer? Oh boy, those Blizzards, they know how to tell a tale, don't they? Anyway, that's by the by. One of the things that Final Fantasy has always done so well during my experiences is that it really does make me feel like I'm making a difference in the world that they've created around. It has been an absolute pleasure to, you know, experience an MMO that isn't afraid to take its time, and, you know, lay out all the pieces of the jigsaw all jumbled out there, and then, you know, help you gradually put it all together. They're also absolutely unafraid at being absolutely brutal at times during the course of the adventure. And, you know, you will experience loss along the way, and that is, you know, part of the journey. The philosophy of, you know, characterization and story being before all, basically the main priority, is a lesson that could be learned by not only AAA gaming companies, but quite a lot of other forms of media as well. The sugar rush you get from all the pretty explosions always leads to a come down, and you're going to leave your customers hungry and dissatisfied if you skip the meat and potatoes. I'm hungry now. Anyway, hats off to Yoshi P and his many little helpers. I hope that they have a very, very restful Christmas, and they come back just in time to install that property lottery in 6.1, because I think that's the only way I'm going to get a place in the lavender beds. The only real challenge I have with Final Fantasy at the moment is choosing a main job. But that's another story. Anyway, I will be back relatively soon with more content of a substantially more spoilery kind. I have many, many questions. But, you know, keep walking along to the end, possums. It is absolutely worth it. It's not my favourite MSQ. I think that's still Heavensward, but it's still very, very good. Anyway, until next time, I am the Conspicuous Moo, and a very good evening to you.